So I'm sure many of you who have tuned in this evening know Michael. He is, of course, an IASA trustee and has been since the beginning of the British Foundation for the Study of Arabia. He's also on the committee of the Seminar for Arabian Studies. He's a research associate of the Khalili Research Centre in Oxford and an honorary fellow of Wolfson College too. He has extremely wide research interests: the languages, scripts and inscriptions of ancient Arabia, literacy in the ancient Near East, prehistory of the Arabic language, rock art of Syria, Jordan and Arabia, the history of the nomads of the Levant and Arabia from the first millennium BC to the rise of Islam. And he is currently director of many different projects that are recording the thousands of graffiti carved by ancient nomads in the deserts of Saudi Arabia and Jordan. You've got on your screen, there's a picture that's not Michael, but it looks a pretty back-breaking and slightly uncomfortable thing to be doing. I'm looking forward to seeing more interesting photographs. Once the inscriptions are collected, they're then edited, and then they're made freely available online, the online corpus of the inscriptions of ancient North Arabia. So we're here all together this evening thanks to modern technology of Zoom. Michael Macdonald is going to be somehow telling us about tweets from an ancient desert. So thank you very much, Michael, and thank you all for attending the lecture.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. That was a very kind introduction, and I'm very honoured to have been asked to give a lecture for IASA, and that so many people have joined. Thank you very much. I hope you won't be too disappointed. Before I start, I should explain that the umbrella there is used to shade the inscriptions when we're photographing them, and is not for the comfort of the team members. I should also apologize for the title of this talk, Tweets from an Ancient Desert, since I have to admit that I have never tweeted in my life, I'm afraid, so it's extremely cheeky of me. But despite this, I hope to show you that the comparison between tweeting and the graffiti of the nomads in the deserts of ancient Arabia is not entirely frivolous. For, like tweets, these graffiti are not communications to a particular individual, but self-expression in a form where, once made, the author has no control over who will read it. Oh, I just have to, yeah, there we are, sorry. Of course, the number of people reading something carved on a rock in the desert cannot be compared to those who read a tweet which has gone viral, but the principle is the same: a spontaneous public expression of personal thoughts and opinions which can be read by anyone. For those of you not familiar with these graffiti, I should describe them briefly and the circumstances in which they came to be carved. At various times between the mid-first millennium BC and the 4th century AD, generations of nomads in the deserts of what is now Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia were literate for the only time in their history before the present day. And they covered the desert rocks with their graffiti. This is surprising, since nomads do not usually have much use for writing, particularly in the days before there was a ready supply of cheap paper or mobile phones. Their societies are perfectly adapted to life without literacy, where memory is highly developed and communication is by word of mouth. In antiquity, writing was much less useful to nomads than it is today. Since papyrus outside Egypt was relatively expensive, the desert did not provide palm leaf stalks or sticks on which texts could be incised, as in ancient South Arabia. They had more urgent uses for the leather provided by their herds, and they used little pottery, since it was likely to get broken when migrating from one place to another, So shirts, which provided a common writing service in settled areas, were also unavailable. The only writing material which they had in abundance were the rocks of the desert. But these are not much use for sending messages or recording information in a nomadic milieu, unless, of course, you're Obelix. So why did these nomads learn to read and write? What possible use could it have been to them? At this distance of time, it's impossible to be sure, but the following seems a likely hypothesis. People in non-literate societies, that is, those societies in which memory and oral communication serve the purposes for which we use writing, people in these societies need to have very well-developed memories in order to store all the information which we would normally write down. This also helps them learn things pretty quickly and easily, and makes them curious. In the desert, curiosity is a survival skill. In a hostile environment, a lack of curiosity can be fatal. So I would suggest that if a nomad went to an oasis like Dadan or Tema or Duma in the purple ovals on the map, and saw a merchant writing a receipt or a letter, he might have asked, "What are you doing?" And when told, might have said, "Will you teach me to do that?" Simply out of curiosity. I myself have had this experience when a Bedouin on an excavation saw me taking notes and asked me to teach him to write. I wrote down the unjoined forms of the Arabic letters for him, pronouncing each of them as I wrote, and the next day he was writing my name and his name in these unjoined forms. A similar thing happened during the excavations at the site of Lachish in Palestine in the 1930s, when the famous Lachish letters, written in the Paleo-Hebrew script, were discovered in 1935. The non-literate Bedouin laborers on the dig were very curious about them. So one of the archaeologists, Gerald Lancaster Harding, as a joke, taught them the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. They mastered this in a remarkably short time, and despite the fact that it had no vowels and had only 22 consonants to represent the 26 or 27 of their Arabic dialect, they immediately started writing short notes to each other and to Lancaster Harding in colloquial Arabic written in the Paleo-Hebrew script. Alas, all the messages were thrown away, but should a future epigraphist discover them, I dread to think of the damage they might do to historical linguistics. Having learnt to write, the nomad would presumably have returned to the desert and no doubt shown off his skills to his family and friends, tracing the letters in the dust or cutting them with a sharp stone on a rock. Materials to write on, the skill would have remained more of a curiosity than something of practical use, except for one thing. Nomadic life involves long periods of solitary idleness, guarding the herds while they pasture, keeping a lookout for game and enemies, etc. Anything that can help pass the time is welcome. Some people carved their tribal marks on the rocks. Others carved drawings, often very skillfully. But now, the ability to write allowed them to sign their drawings. And as you can see, this is also happening today when the Bedouin are again literate. Writing also provided the perfect pastime, and both men and women among the nomads seized it with great enthusiasm. Covering the rocks of the Syro-Arabian deserts with scores of thousands of graffiti. The graffiti was the perfect medium for such circumstances. It could be as short or as long as you wanted, though fewer more than 280 characters. And since you were carving purely for your own amusement, you could say whatever you liked, in whatever order new thoughts occurred to you. And it didn't matter if you made mistakes. There were, of course, also trolls who went around vandalizing other people's graffiti, often by subtly altering the letters to make it say something different or produce nonsense. Because they had nothing but rocks to write on, writing did not penetrate ancient nomadic society and make it dependent on literacy in the way that our societies depend on it. For the nomads, writing seems simply to have remained a pastime, though in the circumstances of nomadic life, this way of avoiding boredom was, in fact, a practical use for writing. We thus have the curious phenomenon of a non-literate society, which retained its use of memory and oral communication for all important and practical matters, but in which the vast majority of the population seems to have been literate. The scores of thousands of graffiti by similarly large numbers of individuals in an area which could never have supported a very large population at any one time suggest that there must have been almost universal literacy among the nomads of the Sahara-Arabian deserts over a considerable period. Sorry, I'm just trying to persuade this to, all right, okay. One could compare the Tuareg in Northwest Africa, who until relatively recently maintained an entirely oral culture, even though they had a script of their own, the Tefiner, which they used purely for fun. For practical purposes, like making a contract or writing a letter, they would ask someone who had been to school to write it in Arabic or French, even when they were writing to another Tuareg, who would then have to get the letter read and translated. In the last half century, however, the Tefiner script has been used by Tuareg nationalists to turn their society into one dependent on literacy, and a standardized form of the script is now used for printed material in schools and for books, printed material in schools and for books, newspapers, and online materials. One way in which the graffiti carved by these ancient nomads differ fundamentally from Twitter is that the motive for carving them seems to have been simply the pleasure or relief in doing so, with no expectation that anyone would read them. They are pure self-expression, not communication. This is a concept which for us is perhaps difficult to grasp because we have to marry the idea of writing purely for our own need or pleasure, as in a secret diary, which we do not want anyone else to see, as with the fact that it's carved on a rock where any passerby can read it. If you're carving a text purely for your own pleasure, you're not concerned with whether or not it's comprehensible to someone else. You know what you mean, and that's all that matters. Thus, there is no incentive to develop a fixed direction of writing, separation of words, ways of showing vowels, etc., which are all things designed to help the reader, and which one finds in scripts used for writing in ink in literate societies, which depend on reading and writing. So in these graffiti, there are no spaces between words and no word dividers, no vowels or even diphthongs. As you can see on the screen, in some of the graffiti, the text can run right to left or left to right, or boustropheden, where the text goes first in one direction and then on the next line in the opposite direction, and so on, as in the text at the top left of the screen. In others, it runs vertically, and in yet others, it can go in any direction you can think of. Because of this, most of the letters can face in any direction, and no letter is dependent on its stance for its identity, as it would be in the Roman alphabet. Some examples here. So letters are never upside down or the wrong way round, as they would be in the Roman script. However, while the layout of the graffito can appear chaotic, the internal structure is almost always the same. They usually start with the author's name and that of his or her father. Very frequently, the genealogy is continued, and depending on how much the author could remember or could be bothered to carve, can be taken right back to the mythical ancestor of the social group to which the author belongs, as you can see on the screen. The group to which you belonged was expressed in terms of a family tree. I'm so sorry. It's important to realize that for these nomads, as still for the Bedouin today, their individual identity and social structure were built on genealogy. The group to which you belonged was expressed in terms of a family tree. You were A, son or daughter of B, son of C, D, E, etc., of the clan of X, of the tribe of Y, of the confederation of Z. But clans, tribes, and confederations, and all other groups, were all expressed as personal names in the genealogy. Not only did genealogy tell you and other people who you were, it also told you who were your close relatives, whom you might never have met because they were far away, and to which groupings you belonged, and to which you owed loyalty. Only two terms for social groups are used in these graffiti. One, ahl, is rare and seems to refer to the immediate family. The basic meaning of ahl in Semitic languages is tent, and from that it comes to mean the family group which shares a tent. The other is al, which can be used of any social group from extended family to nations like the Jews or the Romans, the al-Yahud and the al-Rum, which seem to have been conceived of as genealogically based societies. There were two major lineages, Daif and Awid, each encompassing smaller groups, as you can see on the screen, and individuals could identify themselves by any of these. Often this probably depended on how close to home the person was when he or she was writing. If he or she was in a place where they were known, then, as we would, they would automatically give either no group at all or the closest level of genealogical group. However, if they were far away from their family, they would probably identify themselves by one of the groups in the higher reaches of the family tree, which would be more widely recognizable. This is normal practice both for the Bedouin today and for those of us who are not Bedouin, though we tend to do it with geographical rather than genealogical identities. Thus, for instance, when I'm abroad, I am British, but within the UK, I'm Scottish. If I'm far from home within Britain, I say I live in the Midlands or Warwickshire. If I'm not far from home, I explain that I live in a small village near Stratford-on-Avon, etc. Many of the groups, such as the Ubayshat, seem to have had both settled and nomadic sections. We find Nabatean inscriptions by its members in the towns of the Hauran, as well as, that's in southern Syria, as well as Safavidic graffiti in the desert. Another example is the lineage group Kakab, probably pronounced Kaukab. We also find a few texts by people who identify with the town of Salkhad on Jabal al-Arab in southern Syria, including the one at the bottom of the screen, the author of which says he lives in Salkhad, but was spending the season of the later rains far out in the desert. You can see at the top left of the screen a Greek inscription by a member of the same lineage group who was probably a soldier, since he left his inscription at the site of an Amara, where there was a Roman fort and garrison. He identifies himself by his village and his lineage group, practice which still continues among settled tribes in the countryside of modern Yemen. But to return to the structure of the graffiti, after the name and short or long genealogy comes the narrative, saying what the author was doing or had been doing, how he, she was feeling, rumors that were going about, etc. Not all graffiti had this. The third part was a prayer, and although this is not found in all texts, it is very common. A prayer could be to one, or usually more, of a multitude of deities, almost always including a request for security. Although the basic structure of most of their texts was name, narrative, and finally a prayer, the author quite often had another thought, and so added another bit of narrative, sometimes followed by another prayer, and so on. Moreover, as you can see on the slide, within the narratives, there is not necessarily a logical sequence of statements, but one often random thought after another. We need to appreciate that it takes quite a long time to carve these graffiti, and so there was plenty of opportunity for the author's mind to race ahead or wander. The result can be a bit like stream of consciousness. That carving graffiti was the prime use of writing in the society is also suggested by the only other use we know it was put to. when a much-loved man or woman died, their family and friends would bury them and then build a cairn over the grave. This only happened to certain people, not to everybody. But they appear not to have been people of importance, but people whose family and friends respected and loved them very much and were prepared to go to the enormous work of doing this. Each of the mourners would then carve their own name on a stone and say that they were grieving for the dead person or helping to build the cairn, or both, and would then add this stone to the pile. The structure of these funerary inscriptions is identical to that of the graffiti. Name and genealogy of the author, followed by the narrative saying that she was grieving and or building the cairn for the deceased, often followed by a prayer. Moreover, even the tombstone, in inverted commas, giving the name of the dead person, was couched in this form, as you can see on the screen. I've mentioned that both men and women carved these graffiti. Most of those by women are in the same sort of places as those by men, i.e. out in the middle of the desert, where they would have been watching the animals pasture. However, we also have a large number of limestone, well, not a large number, but about 30, of limestone bowls, beakers, and tripod platters, on which a few men, but mostly women, have carved their graffiti. Unfortunately, all have been looted and sold on the antiquities market, and none have been found in archaeological excavations, so we don't know in what context, for instance, domestic or ritual, they were used. Sorry. The earliest firm date we have for graffiti by nomads in Arabia is the mid-6th century BC, when one of them mentions the Malik Babel, the king of Babylon. The Babylonian Empire fell to the Persians in 539 BC, and its last king, Nabonidus, had spent 10 years of his 17-year reign in Tema, one of the, which you can see on the map, one of the major oases of northwest Arabia, near which this graffito was carved. 8 centuries later, the latest datable graffito by a nomad gives the name and patronym of a woman buried at Hegra, modern Madain Saleh, in AD 267, next to a more detailed epitaph for her in the Nabatean script. In between, we have many that mention the Nabateans, the Jews, the Romans, the Persians, and other peoples. But while these scripts of the nomads continued to be used much later than those of the oases, they are thought to have died out by the 4th century AD, for reasons we cannot explain. Though I should say that this is based purely on the fact that so far no references to Christianity have been found in them. This may be about to change with a discovery by my brilliant colleague, Professor Ahmed Al-Jalad. So watch this space, or watch his space rather than my space. We do not know what, if anything, the nomads called their scripts, but modern scholars have labeled the different types as follows. Safayitic, in red on the map, which is found mainly in southern Syria, northeastern Jordan, particularly in the Basalt Desert, and northern Saudi Arabia. Hismaic, in orange, which is found mainly in the Hisma sand desert of southern Jordan and northwest Saudi Arabia, though there are a few elsewhere. And a large number of graffiti distributed between southern Syria to the borders of Yemen, to which 19th century scholars gave the very misleading label Thamudic, which is shown in black. Thamudic is not actually a script, but a sort of pending file used by epigraphists for all the inscriptions which are clearly in ancient North Arabian scripts, but which are not Safayitic or Hismaic, or one of the Oasis scripts. Very little work has been done on the texts in this pending file, but in the late 1930s, Professor Fred Winnett divided them roughly into 5 groups numbered from A to E. Since then, A and E have been thoroughly investigated and have been removed from the pending file and given the names Temanitic, the script of the Oasis of Tema, and Hismaic, respectively. A script found in the southwest of Saudi Arabia, in dark blue on the map, and formerly called Southern Thamudic or Thamudic F, has recently been deciphered and studied in detail by Christian Robin and Maria Goria, and is now called Himaitic, after the area in which it is found. The remaining groups, Thamudic B, C, and D, are still awaiting detailed study. The tweeting nomads I'm dealing with today are those who carved the Safavidic graffiti, since these are particularly informative. Excuse me. They deal with personal relationships, loneliness, love, missing absent family members or loved ones, and much more. They describe the daily life of their authors, pasturing the flocks and herds, migrating between the Harra and the basalt desert and the Hamad or clay desert beyond, occasionally raiding or being raided, serving in the Roman army, and much else. They had flocks of sheep and herds of goats and camels, and there seems to have been no division between camel herding tribes and those with sheep and goats, as is often assumed. Indeed, individual graffiti deal with both. Their year began with the first rains in October, when they would migrate from the basalt desert, Harra in both Safavidic and modern Arabic, to pasture their livestock in the inner limestone desert of clay, flint and gravel, Mudbar in Safavidic, Hamad in modern Arabic. If the rains continued, they would spend the winter, Shutta, in the Hamad, and also further south in the Nafut sand desert of North Arabia, unfortunately off the map, where they probably took the camels to give birth, since it is warmer there in the winter than it is further north, and camel calves can be particularly sensitive to the cold. February-April was the season of the later rains, Tatha, and could be spent either in the Hamad, if there was still plenty of pasture, or in the Harra, where, because the soil was covered with a carpet of broken up lava, the moisture was preserved for much longer and provides abundant herbage. This pasture in the Harra and the water preserved in natural or man-made collecting points usually last into May and June, the season of early summer, Sayf. Finally, in the dry season, Qayth, between July and October, they usually had to cluster within reach of permanent water sources, Mahadir, most of which were along the north-south line where the Harra and Hamad meet, though there were some within the Harra itself, such as Anamara and Jabal Usays, both of which are mentioned in the graffiti and survive today. In bad years, they had to stay at such places well into the winter and feed their flocks and herds on dry fodder, alaf, which had either been stored from previous good years or had to be bought from merchants coming from the settled areas. It's worth noting that the terms spring and autumn reflect the sedentary agriculturalist experience rather than that of the nomadic pastoralist. Thus the term Rabia, which is used to mean the spring among the sedentaries, is applied by the nomads to any period of the year in which there is plentiful pasture, be it October, December, March, or even sometimes the early summer. Kharif, which is autumn among the sedentaries, is for the nomads, both ancient and modern, the period of the first rains of the year. In good years, individual families of nomads would sometimes plough small areas of the Harra which were without stones, and sow cereals, probably barley, opportunistically. They would then return later in the year to harvest the cereals, and this practice was continued until very recently in northeastern Jordan. Indeed, at least 6 different rock drawings showing ploughing and signed in Safavidic have been found far out in the basalt desert. An interesting inscription says that the author both drove the camels, and they're all interesting, of course, but a particularly interesting inscription in this case says that the author both drove the camels to the inner desert and sowed a shallow depression bare of stones, Rahaba, in both Safavidic and Arabic. However, the graffiti also described the years when the sky god, Baal Shamin, the Lord of Heaven, held back the rain. This resulted in dearth, sometimes over whole areas of the Roman provinces of Syria and or Arabia. And the province-wide dearth is actually mentioned in some of the inscriptions. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that several texts mention that the authors had been on a pilgrimage to the temple of Baal Shamin at Syria on Jabal Haran, though in one case at least, the author says the pilgrimage was in vain. Only occasionally do they mention hunting, perhaps because if you are lying in wait for game, you don't want to make any sound that could warn it off, and carving on basalt can be a noisy business. On the other hand, many of their rock drawings show hunts both on horseback with short throwing spears, and you can see one in the hand of the rider there and the other in the oryx there. And perhaps I should just mention in passing that this seems to be a very clear example that of pre-Islamic clothing. The author appears to be wearing the rida and the izar, which is the shawl and the cloth around the waist, which is still used, of course, for men on the pilgrimage to Mecca, and is always said to have been based on pre-Islamic costume. They also used long thrusting spears, as you can see here, and this rider has a magnificent plume, and the horse has either a very dramatic forelock or possibly a plume as well. Many of the drawings do show that their horses were given plumes, just as taxis in modern Arabia have peacock feathers at the front. And they also used bows and arrows on foot when they're on foot. But it looks as if the gazelle probably came off better in this encounter. They also used hounds, as you can see, and it is good to see that the oryx are actually getting their own back here. It's worth noting that there you can see the horse has a feather and a forelock, and the physical appearance of the horse is very, very similar to the Arabian horse today, a small head and a tail that rises up before it falls. This one, this rider appears to have trousers, as you can see around his legs. Presumably these scenes were drawn after the event or in anticipation. There is one inscription saying that a wolf had taken the author's dog, and another saying the author was grieving because his dog had got lost. They hunted dangerous carnivores. They also hunted dangerous carnivores like lions, hyenas, and wolves, as well as herbivores for food such as ibex, oryx, and gazelle. These hunts were not sporting activities, but an essential part of protection for themselves and their herds against carnivores, and food gathering in the case of herbivores. Some archaeologists and anthropologists have made a false distinction between the hunter-gatherer way of life on the one hand and that of the pastoralist on the other. You can see in two drawings on the same rock, this one and this one, the pastoralist using an ancient prehistoric construction called a kite, which was used for driving gazelle into a pen, and then with the little circles around, people would pop up and start shooting them with arrows. This is being used for herding goats, which are distinguished by their short vertical tails. And in the drawings by these nomads, there are various conventions which one can see of how to distinguish one stick figure animal from another by certain characteristics. So as I say, goats are shown with short vertical tails, whereas in the this is a hunting scene where you have on the far right a man holding 3 dogs on a leash, and at the top, in front of the dogs, there is a gazelle and that has a short horizontal tail, as does the one on the left, facing the dogs. And this is because when gazelle are running away, their tail sticks out horizontally. And so that is the mark of a gazelle. At the bottom, there is what is almost certainly an onager, wild ass, which are almost always shown with a tassel on the end of their tail, like this. Obviously, there are problems with perspective, and I don't think probably that the man in the middle was really lying down to shoot with his bow and arrow. So, yes, but these inscriptions and drawings and the ones here on, as well as many others, show quite clearly that their authors used both herding and hunting, and this makes perfect sense. Butchering their own domestic animals inevitably diminished their capital. So if they could kill a wild one, so much the better. And I'm told that gazelle meat in particular is delicious, so my apologies to vegetarians. They also gathered truffles, kama, a great delicacy to the Bedouin, as to us, more especially since in the desert, they only develop in years when there has been a large amount of rain for several months. The truffles are then the icing on the cake amidst general rejoicing. These nomads were remarkably well informed about events in the world beyond the desert. In this inscription, for instance, it seems likely that Caesar's son refers to Germanicus, the adopted son of the Emperor Tiberius, who came to Syria in AD 18 and was received with great acclaim wherever he went. In another graffito, he is mentioned by name. However, his sudden death in Antioch the following year gave rise to widespread conspiracy theories. If this identification is correct, and if by Philippus the author means Philip the Tetrarch, he was quite right to scoff at the story that he had also died, since he continued to rule the Hauran for another 21 years. Incidentally, this is a good example of the disjointed form of many of these graffiti, carved as thoughts occurred to the author. Some of these nomad tweeters may have acquired their news of events in the settled areas through service in the Nabatean or Roman armies. A number of the inscriptions say that their authors served as soldiers in units raised from particular tribes, as here. Others say that their authors mutinied or fled from Roman territory. Some even seem to be dated by the year Caesar announced the province, that is, the year Trajan officially declared Provincia Arabia in AD 111, some 5 years after it had been actually acquired in 106. A cluster of 3 Safietic graffiti and 1 Greek has recently been discovered in northeastern Jordan. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a Safietic graffito by someone who calls himself Gaius Thu al-Rum, Gaius of the people of Rome. The graffito is couched perfectly in Safietic and is expressed as if Rome was the author's lineage group. My colleague Ahmed Al-Jalad has suggested that the Greek graffito at the top right may have been carved by the author of the long Safietic text at the top left, and that the final word may be a transliteration into Greek letters of the Safietic word Yesrat. He is serving in a military unit, presumably because the author did not know the Greek word for that. There are also several texts dated by Persian invasions or clashes between the Persians and Romans. In the 3rd century AD, there were successive Persian invasions of Syria, though these were mainly in the north. However, two Safietic graffiti mention the year the Persians came to Bosra, the capital of Provincia Arabia in the Hauran. It's been suggested that this might refer to the Persian invasion of Syria in AD 259, in preparation for which Bosra was refortified. But as far as I know, the Persians never got as far south as this. Indeed, we seem to have no record of a Persian attack on Bosra before AD 614, which is generally held to be long after the Safietic inscriptions ceased to be carved. So this is a precious historical reference to an otherwise unknown attack, but which is alas undatable. The nomads themselves often came under attack by peoples from further south in Arabia, such as the Hawalat, the people whom Pliny calls Abelitai, and places near Hegra, modern Madain Saleh, the Lycianites from Dadan, modern Alula, and the famous Arab tribe of Tai. There is a lot of sadness in these graffiti. In some, the author says he or she is missing or longing for friends or relatives, and this is a constant theme in the inscriptions, very often by women, carved on stone vessels, as here. Many of the texts list the names of people the author is grieving for, sometimes seemingly large numbers of his or her family. Sometimes people grieved for are dead, sometimes captives, sometimes just far away. There are many which say that the author found the inscription or traces of someone and was sad, presumably because the person was dead or far away, while several say that the author grieved for friend after friend. So while I've said that these graffiti are written as though the author did not expect anyone to read them, we know that quite often they were read. Yet they very often express a vulnerability which is surprising. Authors admit that they are frightened, lonely, hungry, and cold. Almost invariably, they pray for security, as well as for rain, a change of circumstances, booty, revenge for the death of a loved one, etc. However, we should not think that life was all work and misery. They also clearly had parties, and the drawings show a number of musical instruments, often played by women. Among these, the double flute and the lyre were the most popular. So you can see the double flute in the bottom left-hand corner and the bottom left-hand and the lyre in the top row. And people playing drums or with small tambourines. As you can see, some of these women musicians wore belts with long tassels and very elaborate hairdos. The belts with long tassels and very elaborate hairdos. Note also in passing the clear distinction in the drawing between the horse and the donkey and the appropriate positions of the riders on each. However, there were other rather less respectable women entertainers in various states of undress who wiggled their hips, as shown by the flying tassels of their belts, and drew out their hair in a provocative fashion. I'm afraid I can't really do that. However, there were other rather less, there are even some drawings which show the physical appreciation of their male audiences. These women, who are described as singing or dancing girls and female slaves in the graffiti, were alas apparently considered fair game in raids. And on the picture on the right, you can see perhaps just, it's not very clear I'm afraid, but perhaps just see a horseman tapping his lance on one of them to claim her as his booty. And this is what you did in raids, and still when raiding was still going in the early 20th century. That you would tap your lance on a camel and say, this one's mine. And this is shown also in pictures of raiding with the Safietic inscriptions. Of course, in modern raiding, slaves were immune, could not be treated as booty, but this wasn't so apparently in antiquity, alas. These tweeters also had a sense of humor and one of their tricks was to add rude remarks to someone else's inscription. As you can see, the humor is pretty schoolboyish, I'm afraid. They also played games with their own inscriptions. This one is carved over 11 faces in a line of stones, which would appear have not been moved in 2000 years. I somehow doubt that anyone bothered to read it until I came along. There is even one conversation identified by my colleague Chiara Della Puppa, in which, as you can see, someone called Hamasik claims that he had built an enclosure. Then someone called Khalid came along and said that he had built it instead. Hamasik then comes back, finds Khalid's inscription and calls him a liar, reiterating that it was he, Hamasik, who built it. Finally, Khalid just calls Hamasik a liar. It's impossible to know at this distance of time whether they were serious or just indulging in banter. One rather suspects the latter. There is even what may be wordplay in the graffito on the top left, and another on the bottom right suggests that its author knew some, at least, of the traditional names of the letters and adapted their shapes to fit the names. Humor in basalt tweets continues today, when the nomads are again literate, thanks to army schools in the deserts of Jordan and the invention of the mobile phone, which, of course, like anywhere else, everyone wants to have. You can see two examples on the screen. For reasons best known to himself, the author of the one on the left has carved the recorded response you get on the phone if the person you're calling can't answer. Carving this would have taken a lot of time and effort, and is only worth doing if it passed the time and kept boredom at bay. The one on the right is by a local Bedouin who had helped expeditions recording Safavidic inscription and decided one day to carve this welcome to an exhibition of them, i.e. just those lying where they had been carved. Here you can see other examples of ingenuity in employing literacy, where individuals have written their names with small stones in an area where the basalt is not suitable for inscribing. We know that these nomads believed in a number of deities, of which the most popular were the goddess Alat and the goddess Raddu. We have innumerable prayers to these and other deities, asking for security, rain, a change of circumstances, a safe reunion with loved ones, booty from raids, delivery from adversity, etc. But the only hint we get in these inscriptions of their beliefs about these deities, that is, the mythology of their religion, are these two unique texts where Alat is called the daughter of Raddu. Apart from Baal Shamin, who was in charge of rain, none of the deities seems to have had a specialism, and any deity could be asked for anything. Indeed, many prayers are addressed to whole lists of gods and goddesses. The two great tribal confederations each had their guardian deity, or Gad, both of whom are invoked in the unusual situation in the text translated on the screen. There were also goddesses of certain places, such as Dathan, as here, which we have not been able to identify. I mean the place, sorry. And goddesses of Anamara and Jebel Usais, places of semi-permanent water. Finally, it's worth noting that in a handful of inscriptions, very popular deities are linked to certain places, as the most popular deity in these inscriptions, Nat, is here linked with the former kingdom of Ammon in what is now northern Jordan, while in another graffito, the god of the Nabateans, Dushara, is linked to Rekem, the Semitic name for Petra. The most extreme example of rounding up deities from all over the place is in another graffito where, as you can see, the prayer reads, O Lat, let there be retribution against Thikkar, son of Thalam, and again, O Lat, let there be retribution, and O Baal Shamin, and Shai Hakwam, and Dushara, and the god of the tribe of Time, and the protector of Daif, and the protector of the Nabateans, and the god Hafalas of the tribe of Time, Yahio, let there be retribution, unquote. Ironically, though, through these graffiti, which I have frivolously called tweets, we know vastly more about life in the desert between the last century BC, and the 4th century AD than we do about life in the contemporary towns and villages, where most people were probably illiterate and anyway were doing jobs which gave them little time to sit around tweeting. Those of them who could write would generally have done so on perishable materials, which have long since disintegrated or been lost. So by a happy combination of what might be called accidental literacy among the nomads, a way of life in which large numbers of them needed something to help pass the time, and the fact that they used durable surfaces to write on, we have a picture of how their society worked, of their social interactions, both with each other and with the outside world, of their adventures and their views on contemporary political events. In fact, just what an IT epigraphist would find when researching Twitter in 2000 years' time. But above all, these graffiti give us a direct line to the emotions of these nomads, their hopes and fears, their sadness and longing, their sense of humor, all expressed in very immediate terms, so that reading the tweets of these individuals, long dead, we empathize with them as we might if their messages had just appeared on our phones. I end as I began, with an umbrella. Thank you.